There are relationships in life that need no name, no holding hands, no photos of a kiss to preserve. Just two people walking side by side, quietly lifting each other through seasons of silence and storms. Audrey Hepburn, the woman who brought gentle light to every frame. Hubert de Givenchy, the man who didn't embellish beauty, but softly awakened it. They were never lovers. But if love is about understanding each other to the core, then theirs was one of the most beautiful bonds ever told. In silence, a love without touch, yet deep enough, enduring enough to transcend time. Paris summer of 1953. The city of lights shimmered with soft sunshine and the scent of freshly baked bread drifting through cobbled streets. Inside a small fashion studio on Avenue Georges First, Hubert de Givenchy, a 26-year-old man with intelligent eyes and masterful hands, was meticulously reviewing every detail of his latest collection. Despite his youth, Givenchy had already stirred the French fashion world with his understated elegance and precision, like a conductor of a whispered symphony. That day, his assistant walked in with a message: "Mademoiselle Hepburn has arrived." Givenchy was momentarily surprised. Katharine Hepburn. The Hollywood legend had come to see him. He stood up slightly anxious, adjusted his collar, and prepared to greet a star. But the door opened, and it wasn't Katharine. There was no dazzling spotlight stepping into the room, only a slender, modest figure. Audrey Hepburn, with her large brown eyes, long lashes, and a presence as soft as morning mist, bowed politely, her voice carrying a blend of English, Dutch, and something delightfully unplaceable. No pride, no extravagance, just a young woman hoping to be heard. At first, Givenchy declined. His schedule was packed, and he had prepared for someone entirely different. But when Audrey quietly spoke about her film Sabrina, about playing a simple girl lost in a world of aristocrats, about wanting a dress that lets the character breathe, something inside him slowed down. It wasn't because she was famous, nor because she was beautiful. It was because Audrey spoke with humility, with a passion unadorned, and with a delicate soul he recognized at once, like a pencil sketch that needed no color. Reluctantly, he allowed her to try on a few experimental pieces from the new collection. Nothing elaborate. But when Audrey slipped into one of the dresses, the entire room fell silent. The dress needed no alteration. Her figure needed no adjustment. Everything clicked. Not just in size, but in spirit. They sat together after the fitting. Not many words were exchanged, but anyone witnessing that moment would know something had begun. A connection beyond definition, yet deep enough to last a lifetime. That day in Paris, the world unknowingly witnessed the birth of a lifelong relationship, not of physical romance or glamorous contracts, but of a love without touch, rooted in deep understanding and nurtured by tender silence. Audrey Hepburn was unlike any woman Hubert de Givenchy had ever designed for. She didn't demand perfection. She didn't use her appearance to dominate a room. But it was exactly that humility in her ever-curious eyes, as if constantly asking, "Am I being a bother?" that drew his attention, and eventually his quiet admiration. Hubert once said, "I didn't design for Audrey like a client. I stitched each seam as if I were sewing for the stillness in her heart." From their first collaboration in Sabrina, their relationship transcended that of designer and actress. Each outfit was more than fabric. It was a soft suit of armor helping Audrey step onto the stage of the world without feeling too small. She once confided in him that she didn't see herself as beautiful, that her body was too thin, her shoulders too bony, her legs too awkward. But Hubert saw her differently. To him, Audrey was a symphony of simplicity and grace, the kind of beauty fashion needed not to shine, but to breathe. When he designed her first boat-neck cocktail dress, Audrey wore it and whispered, "This is me, but a little prettier, just a little." Hubert smiled and said nothing, because he knew it was Audrey who brought his designs to life. Gradually, she wore no other brand to official events. Whether it was the Oscars, Cannes, or Grand Galas, Givenchy's name always followed her. Not because of contracts, not for branding, but because she trusted him to guard the truest image of herself. Audrey was not a muse who sat still to be drawn. She was a collaborator, a living inspiration. They worked together like two artists composing a piece of music, she with her delicate boldness. he with his razor-sharp lines and impeccable restraint. There were days when they simply sat together looking at fabric and exchanging glances. Few words, yet always understanding. Hubert knew Audrey didn't need a dress to impress. She needed one that allowed her to be herself in a world that constantly asked women to be more than who they were. And she found that not in the mirror, but in Hubert's eyes. The first to see her not as a star, but as a soul that needed to be wrapped gently, not in admiration, but in understanding. In 1961, Hollywood witnessed the birth of a new icon. On the big screen, Audrey Hepburn became Holly Golightly, the charming, mysterious, and lonely party girl in Breakfast at Tiffany's. But it was the film's opening scene. Holly standing silently outside Tiffany's, holding a croissant, gazing dreamily that became immortal. She wore a sleeveless black dress, modest in length, no lace, no bows, no fuss. Long black gloves to her elbows. A pearl necklace draped effortlessly over her neck. A high bun and oversized sunglasses. It all looked spontaneous, but in truth it was a poem, and the poet was Hubert de Givenchy. That little black dress wasn't just fashion, it was a declaration. A declaration of effortless elegance of beauty that didn't need to prove itself, and of a man who understood a woman so intimately he could speak for her heart without words. No one else could have designed that dress, and Audrey knew it. Hubert knows me better than I know myself, she once whispered in an interview. And Hubert, he rarely said much, but when asked, he always smiled and replied, I simply listened to her in the way the world doesn't know how to listen to women. People still wonder why they were never lovers. Why no romantic relationship bloomed when everything seemed to be there. Perhaps because they didn't need one. Some feelings are too beautiful to be named, too delicate to be touched, and too pure to fit in conventional definitions. When Audrey wore that black dress on screen, she didn't just bring Holly to life. She wore a piece of Hubert's soul. It was his gift to her, a beauty acknowledged, respected, and protected in a world often cruel to gentle women. From that moment on, the little black dress was no longer just a garment. It became a symbol. And more than that, it was a love letter never spoken between two people who chose to stand beside each other rather than fall into one another. At some point, Audrey began to feel suffocated by the very spotlight the world had given her. The endless photo shoots, the repetitive scripts, the praise that echoed so loudly it sometimes made her feel empty. She was an icon, the goddess of elegance, the woman every man dreamed of, and every woman wanted to be. But perhaps only she knew how often it all felt like a mask, stitched together with expectation. In those moments, Audrey often returned to Paris, not to perform, but to simply be. And there was always a chair waiting for her in Hubert's quiet studio, with a pot of Earl Grey tea, a few sprigs of dried lavender, and a gaze that never judged. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. She could sit there, legs crossed, reading a book or just staring out the window while Hubert adjusted the seams of a new design. Occasionally, he'd ask if she preferred beige to light gray. She'd smile and nod. Sometimes they played classical music not to listen, but to make the room feel less empty. Their friendship, if one could call it that, needed no ceremony. No romantic dinners. No expensive gifts. Just presence. Perhaps that was the highest form of love, when you need nothing from the other but their being. Hubert was not one to pry. He never asked about Audrey's failed marriage, about the times she felt unworthy as a mother, or the fatigue that came with every camera flash. But he always noticed when her eyes dimmed. And in those moments, he'd hand her a soft blue fabric and say, let's make a dress that feels like a breeze. Shall we? No one understood their bond. Even Sean, Audrey's son, later said, Givenchy was never an uncle, a godfather, or a lover to my mother. He was a place. To Audrey, Hubert was unconditional support, a man who didn't love her for being a star, but for her fight to stay kind in a world of masks. And to Hubert, Audrey was not just a muse. She was proof that true beauty lives not in form, but in the quiet empathy that wraps others in grace. As Audrey entered her 40s, her deepest desire was no longer an award-winning role or a film triumph. What she longed for was peace. She had lived under stage lights long enough, worked with the greatest directors, received the most coveted honors. Now she wanted only to be a mother, a wife, and herself. In 1968, she divorced Mel Ferrer, a marriage that once gave her hope for family but left her heart weary. Not long after she married Italian doctor Andrea Dotti and moved to Switzerland, a place of green hills, no cameras, no stage. And in this retreat, she kept in touch with very few people. Hubert was one of them. They wrote letters, not long, emotional ones, but brief exchanges between old friends who understood the rhythms of each other's lives. Audrey shared stories about her garden, her son Luca learning to ride a bike, and a vegetable soup recipe from her Swiss neighbor. Hubert replied with hand-drawn cards, sometimes only saying, "I still have the pale blue scarf you picked, it remains in the studio." Like a memory unfaded. In one letter, Audrey wrote Hubert, "I once thought I needed Hollywood to feel alive. But it turns out just knowing you're still designing, still remembering me in those scraps of fabric, that's enough." No grand declarations of love, just the quiet music of two hearts that stayed connected, free of labels. In 1976, Audrey returned to the screen in Robin and Marian opposite Sean Connery, a gentle role, more memory than ambition. And when the film premiered in a quiet corner of a Parisian theater, Hubert sat silently. No introductions, no interviews. Just eyes glistening as her face lit up the screen, his Audrey still herself. For Audrey, the greatest comeback was living truthfully. For Hubert, the deepest joy was seeing her remain graceful, simple, and dignified long after leaving the spotlight. And so he stayed, not as a lover, but as the quiet witness to the years she spent finding herself again. In the late 1980s, the world was stunned to see Audrey Hepburn return, not on screen, not in Givenchy gowns, but in the poorest corners of the earth, holding frail children, her feet dusty, her eyes full of compassion and hunger for justice. She had become a UNICEF Goodwill ambassador, but more than a title, Audrey called it the most important role of my life. She went to Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, even Vietnam, not with makeup or a camera crew, but as a mother, a woman who had survived war, hunger, and illness, now returning to say, "I understand. I am here." When Hubert saw the photos and articles, he rarely commented. But every time Audrey was about to leave for a mission, he sent her a light pastel silk scarf with a small note to remind you that wherever you go, you're still Audrey. She kept all the scarves not worn around her neck, but pressed between pages of her notebook beside vaccine schedules, emergency supply lists, and the names of children she promised to return to. During a 1992 trip to Somalia, Audrey's body began to give out. Upon returning, doctors diagnosed her with terminal colon cancer. The news came like a silent bell. She remained calm, unafraid. But for Hubert, the man who had followed her all his life, it was the first time his face betrayed his grief. He visited her in Switzerland, bringing a bouquet of lavender, an old leather notebook, and a white linen dress, light as a cloud. "No need to wear it," he said, handing it to her. "Just so you know someone still wants you to feel held." Audrey took it without a word, but in her eyes was something Hubert understood without hearing. "Thank you for always being there, for never making me pretend." The world knew Audrey through her iconic roles, but Hubert more than anyone saw her when no one else looked. When she was exhausted, when she fell silent, when all she needed was someone to believe that being a gentle, decent woman was enough. And if her final role was as a humanitarian angel, then Hubert, as he had been for 40 years, was the one who stitched her wings. January 20th, 1993. The skies over Switzerland were grayer than usual. Snow fell gently but thick enough to blanket the village where Audrey lived, as if the world itself wanted to turn pure to say farewell to someone who had lived with such tenderness. Audrey passed away in her sleep. No cries, no frantic goodbyes. Just one final soft breath, the way she had walked through life, quiet, unpretentious, yet leaving a void nothing could fill. Hubert de Givenchy received the news at 6 a.m. in Paris. He was preparing a new collection. He sat still for 10 minutes, saying nothing. Then he rose, opened a wooden box containing fabrics once designed for Audrey, and a photo from 1955, Audrey smiling Hubert, gazing at her as if memorizing every detail. Her funeral was private. Her family honored her wish for simplicity. No expensive flowers, no long speeches. But one man in a gray suit stood at the back, holding a bouquet of pale lavender. His eyes didn't weep, only watched. Hubert didn't speak. But he left a handwritten note in the guest book: "You are the most beautiful silhouette I ever created." Not because of how you look, but because you never made others feel less standing next to you. Instead, you lifted them with your gaze, your faith, and your way of making beauty kind. After the funeral, he didn't return to Paris immediately. He visited the garden Audrey once tended, where she grew lavender daisies and white roses. He stood there for hours as if waiting for a familiar voice to rise from the breeze. Back in Paris, Hubert hung a portrait of Audrey in his studio, not one in a glamorous gown, but a candid shot of her bending down to tie a little girl's shoe during a charity mission. No posing, no lighting, just a woman living from the heart. From that moment, he never designed another dress for any celebrity. He once said, "There are things when they've reached the absolute that must never be repeated." Audrey was my absolute. After Audrey's passing, Hubert no longer designed for the stars. His studio remained open, but there were no grand gowns, no blinding runway lights. He spent his time with lavender and old sketches, especially the ones he and Audrey once created together. Paris bustled on as always. But in the small room at the end of the hall filled with jasmine tea and soft afternoon light, there was a silence that couldn't be replaced. Audrey, in her own way, was still there. Hubert rarely spoke about her, but when young students visited and asked who had inspired him most, he would quietly open a drawer. Inside was a worn handkerchief embroidered with Audrey in white thread. Beside it, a notebook filled with neat handwriting, color notes, fabric textures, fitting dates, and the quiet things Audrey had once murmured while trying on dresses. "This color makes me feel like morning fog. I don't want to be prettier than anyone. I just want to be me seen." To Hubert, every word was a lesson not about fashion, but about the elegance of restraint, the kind of beauty that never imposes or tries to shine. Just like Audrey. Once a young journalist asked if she were alive today, what would she wear? Hubert smiled. Probably beige, a pair of flats, and that old scarf she carried everywhere. Then he paused for a long time and added, "Because Audrey never used fashion to impress, she used kindness." Every year on Audrey's birthday, he placed a lavender bouquet in his studio. No name, just a habit, like keeping a chair empty in case someone dear unexpectedly returns. And time passed. Those who had known them aged. Hollywood changed. Fashion evolved. But Audrey's name through Hubert's eyes never dimmed. She was no longer in new photos, but present in everything beautiful he still remembered. Someone once said, "Death ends a life, not a love." To Hubert, Audrey was never gone. She had only stepped back gently so he could continue living with the best part of what they had shared. Hubert de Givenchy aged with quiet dignity, just like his designs. In his 80s, he no longer visited the studio every day, but kept his morning walks in the garden, checking if the lavender had bloomed and browsing old sketchbooks where pencil marks had faded, but the emotion remained vivid. People often asked, "What do you regret most in life?" Hubert always answered with a gentle smile. "Nothing. I had the honor of designing for Audrey." He never wrote a memoir, never made a documentary. When publishers suggested glamorous titles like The Legend of Givenchy, he declined. "The dresses would still be beautiful without me, but without Audrey, I am nothing." In 2010, a Paris museum planned a retrospective to honor him. Hubert had only one request: to include a room dedicated to Audrey, not her fashion photos, but candid images, Audrey holding children in Ethiopia, covered in flour during baking watering flowers in her garden. He said, "If you want to understand me, look at her." Once a close friend asked Hubert, "Did you ever love her?" He sipped his tea, thought for a long time, and answered, "Not in the way people usually mean. But if love means wanting someone to be free to be fully themselves and to be at peace, then yes, I loved her more than anyone." In his final years, Hubert lived in an old house outside Paris where the afternoon sun cast long shadows on the wooden floor. On the wall hung a portrait of Audrey smiling, no makeup, no gown, just herself, like autumn sunlight. As his health declined, he gave a simple instruction to his family: "Let me go in the gray suit I designed for my last photo with Audrey." She once said that color made me look like a gentle afternoon. On March 10th, 2018, Hubert passed away. No fanfare, no grand farewell. He left as he had lived, gracefully, elegantly, holding beauty softly to his chest. People say time heals all things, but some connections like Hubert and Audrey's don't fade with time. They become clearer, like a forgotten fragrance that suddenly returns, recalling a nameless season of love that once brushed past our lives. Years after both Audrey and Hubert left this world, people still speak of them. Audrey's films continue to play on weekend TV. Givenchy's designs still grace runways, museums, and women who cherish timeless elegance. But what people remember most is not the fame or the fashion. It's the story. The story of two people who chose to love differently, through glances, through presence, through silence, through kindness. In an age of instant love, where relationships are defined by status updates and selfies, Audrey and Hubert's bond felt like a classical melody, soft without chorus, but echoing for decades. Those who met them often said it wasn't their beauty, it was how they made others feel more beautiful in their presence. Audrey with eyes that listened, Hubert with hands that honored the most fragile parts of a woman's soul. They never tried to have each other. They simply chose to be beside each other in the way life allowed. Today in Paris, a small exhibition is titled Une amitié éternelle, an eternal friendship. Inside are handwritten letters, sketches, black and white photos, and at the center, a simple black dress in a glass case. No label, because everyone knows it's that dress, and everyone knows it belonged to her, made by him, sewn with unspoken reverence. People come, they look, some cry, not from sorrow, but from having touched something pure. That love needs no vows, no grand gestures, no physical touch, only a gaze, a moment of listening, and a loyalty that never once wavered. In a world that never stops changing, Audrey and Hubert remind us the truest love doesn't possess. It simply stays long enough, gently enough, so the other knows they were never alone.